American progressives responded with mixed sentiments to the news of the outbreak of war in Europe in August 1914 and later to U.S. involvement in the war in 1917. Never united, progressives found themselves sharply divided by the war. Some progressives viewed it as a tragic setback, whereas others seized the war as a fortuitous moment to expand federal regulatory power and forge a stronger nation and world. In many ways, World War I proved to be the death knell of progressivism. Boldly expanding federal power and the nation's global role, President Wilson and his supporters overreached, sowing seeds for a massive backlash in the post-war years. Although progressives in the US overall did not have the same success as their European counterparts, they nevertheless initiated reforms that permanently changed the role of government and the lives of the nation's citizens. For some progressives, World War I shattered their optimistic faith in human progress and the improvability of human nature. Some progressives had even suggested that humankind had outgrown war and its remarkable advancement. It was unthinkable to them that the war and progress could go hand in hand. Both Jane Addams and Wisconsin's Fighting Bob La Follette boldly condemned American involvement in the European conflict. Adams predicted that the war would, quote, set back progress for a generation. La Follette, who after successful terms as governor was elected senator from Wisconsin, was only one of 6 senators who voted against the war declaration in April 1917, the popular press depicting him as a German-loving traitor. Other progressives, however, saw the war as a golden moment, a chance to institute bold changes both abroad and at home. President Wilson, who framed the war as a war to make the world safe for democracy, envisioned an America providing world leadership, molding a progressive world order that would dismantle empires and tyrannical governments and replace them with democratic institutions. He and other progressives also saw the war as an opportunity to broaden public power at home by expanding the scope of the federal government and diminishing the clout of private enterprise. In addition, they hoped to create a sense of common purpose among the American people. When Congress declared war against the Central Powers in April 1917, the Wilson administration faced the paramount task of mobilizing the nation on an unprecedented scale. Massive mobilization required a major expansion of federal power and unprecedented interventions in business and labor. New federal agencies, taking charge of regulating nearly every aspect of the American economy, advanced the progressive agenda. The federal government extended its unprecedented economic expansion into a war for the American mind. Fearing disloyalty, especially among hyphenated Americans, those who had come to the U.S. as part of the new immigration of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Wilson administration embarked on a massive propaganda campaign to ensure the loyalty of all the American people. German Americans became prime victims of patriotic hatred. Labor radicals, especially socialists, also bore the brunt of the federal government's repression. A series of laws, including the Alien Act, the Alien Enemies Act, the Espionage Act, the Sedition Act, and the Selective Service Act, allowed the federal government to fine, jail, and in some cases even deport anyone who hindered the war effort. Free speech was an early casualty of the war. Socialist Eugene V. Debs, who had garnered nearly 1 million votes for president in 1912, was slapped with a 10-year jail sentence for speaking out in opposition to the war. The federal government also conducted raids on international workers of the world halls, using the war as a chance to rid the nation of the troublesome wobblies once and for all. Hundreds of them were jailed, and one was lynched. While the New York Times condemned the murder, the newspaper quickly added that, quote, the IWW agitators are, in effect, and perhaps in fact, agents of Germany, end quote. The war also heightened racial conflict. When the war halted European immigration, desperate Southern blacks seized the opportunity to migrate north and fill the ranks of Northern industry. The Great Migration, as it would be known, changed the face of Northern cities as blacks, leaving the repression of the Jim Crow South behind for opportunity in the North, quote, voted with their feet. The massive influx of blacks and job competition led to some of the worst race riots in the nation's history. In East St. Louis in July 1917, angry white mobs, incited by a rumor that a white man had been killed by a black man, raged for a week, leaving at least several hundred blacks dead. The end of the war in November 1918 did not bring about the end of conflict and repression. In 1919, 25 race riots ripped apart American cities. At the same time, 100% Americanism soon became channeled into a Red Scare, in which the federal government crushed what remained of the nation's radical organizations. Labor unions, intent on keeping the gains they had made during the war, while employers aimed to regain their power, called a series of strikes in some of the nation's most important industries, including textiles and steel. Rather than unite Americans by forging the new, collective nation that progressives hoped for, the war and its aftermath seemed only to divide the country. The war unleashed a rational and often uncontrollable hatred that was the antithesis of the rational and organic progressive vision of society. The American public had grown tired of remaking their nation and the world, and many progressives had become disillusioned, their faith in humanity shattered. The U.S. Senate, rejecting the Treaty of Versailles and Wilson's progressive vision to, quote, make the world safe for democracy and a new world order, reflected the general sentiments of a nation weary of crusades, both domestically and internationally. Despite the domestic calamities engendered by the Great War, women's suffrage, fought for by generations of women since the mid-19th century, received a major boost. In the 1910s, a new generation of suffragists, headed by Alice Paul, reinvigorated the movement. In 1907, Paul, a settlement house worker, moved to England to study social work and met suffragists Christabel and Emmeline Pankhurst. Convinced that women would never get the vote with petitions or persuasion, the Pankhursts advocated direct action, which included civil disobedience and hunger strikes to publicize their cause. Paul became a disciple of the Pankhursts, participated in numerous protests, and even served jail time for activities. Paul returned to the U.S. in 1910 and immediately joined the National American Women's Suffrage Association, headed by Carrie Chapman Catt. She soon found herself at odds with Catt, and while Catt endorsed Wilson for president in 1912 and considered him an ally in the struggle, Paul borrowed a page from her British mentors and insisted on pressuring Wilson directly through dramatic protests. In 1913, Paul organized a massive parade of women down Pennsylvania Avenue that coincided with Wilson's inauguration. The parade turned violent when male opponents assaulted suffragists. In 1916, Paul severed ties with Catt and Nassau, and with like-minded suffragists, formed the National Women's Party. While Alice Paul and her compatriots successfully pressured Wilson, others played a major role in supporting the war effort, a contribution Wilson could not ignore. More than 1 million American women labored in war industries at home. Women also served as nurses and telephone operators for the American military and worked as volunteers in France for organizations such as the YMCA. In 1920, the states ratified the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. Compared to their European counterparts, progressives in the U.S. had only limited success. In housing, social insurance, and factory legislation, progressives found their reforms curtailed by what one European called the, quote, cast iron constitution of the U.S., traditional legal concepts that emphasized individual and property rights at the expense of a powerful state intervening for the common good. Moreover, progressives seldom transcended class or race. They too often imposed their own middle-class values on those they aimed to help. White progressives not only remained aloof from the nation's race problems, they also often enhanced them. And as moderates treading the middle way, they tended to exhibit caution, which limited the impact of their reforms. Intent on securing their own political power, they diminished the power of those they deemed less worthy, especially immigrants, the working class, and African Americans. But at the same time, they also managed to curb some of industrial capitalism's worst excesses while improving the lives of countless men, women, and children through their wide array of reforms. And despite the shortcomings of their movement, progressives nevertheless bequeathed a valuable legacy to subsequent generations.
Talk about a cooler having trouble. I think I have enough of my own. It's all about my Lucy trouble, and she has caused my heart to mourn. There's another coon about her from Virginia. In society, he's the leader of the day. And now my honey gal is going to quit me. Yes, she's gone and drove the coon away. She's no excuse to turn me loose. I've been abused, and I'm all confused. Lord, 'cause he's what he's in this way with. Oh, coons are looking like to me. I've got another boy, you see, and he's just as good to me. Hey, you nigga, and a tragedy. He spends his money free. I know we can't agree, so I'd like to know how all coons look alike to me. Never said a word to hurt her feelings. I always bought a present by the store. And now my brain was sorrow am I reeling, 'cause she won't accept them anymore. If I treated her wrong, she may have loved me. Like all the rest, she's gonna let me down. If I'm lucky, I'm going to catch my policy and win my sweet thing from town. For I'm worried, yes, I'm desperate, and I've been jealous, and I'll get dangerous. Oh my, it is what she says to me. Well, oh, coons are looking like to me. I've got another boy, you see, and he's just as good to me as you, nigga, ever tried to be. He spends his money free. I know we can't agree, so I'd like to know how all coons look like to me.